It will be about law and Muslim political thought in late colonial North India. So I'd like to welcome Adeel Hussain from New York University, who will be launching a book in conversation with Aatir Rizvi from GCU.
Welcome everybody. We are honored that we are sitting with Adeel Hussain Saab, who has written the book. Before going into details and my discussion pertaining to few questions regarding his book, let me introduce Mr. Adeel Hussain. He is currently Associate Professor in NYU Abu Dhabi, and rest of the introduction he will be giving by himself, because that is very long and I was having a chat with him. So, sir, please introduce yourself and few things about your books so that we can have an interactive section on those.
Well, thank you so much, Aatir, for the kind introduction, and Jakub for the invitation. I'm not sure if he's here. I can't spot him, so I'm assuming that he is attending another session. If you see me looking down on the paper, it's to do with the fact that academic publishing is very slow, which means that when you finish a manuscript, it may take multiple years for it to go into print and into publication. So I finished writing and submitted the manuscript 6 years ago. So some of the ideas are just sort of pinned down onto this. If I do this, it just means that I'm looking at my cheat sheet. So just a brief introduction. As Aatir said, I'm an associate professor of law at New York University. Before that, I was in the Netherlands in a place called Leiden, smallish town close to The Hague. And before that, at the Max Planck Institute of Public International Law in Heidelberg. I have a PhD from the University of Cambridge, and this book is really the outcome of my dissertation. So the PhD dissertation that I wrote at the University of Cambridge is essentially converted into this book. Slight modifications, of course, a lot less of the academic jargon, but in essence, it's an academic publication. So let me just begin with what I tried to do with the book. So the book tries to capture the political thought behind the legal ideas that Indian Muslims had in the run-up to decolonization. I conclude my study in the 1940s, which is before the time that everything got terribly heated in the run-up of nationalism. So once you have nationalism, you have a kind of narrowing down of the imagination, but there's a lot of different variations of what a future constitution may look like in the early part of the 20th century, and that's really what the book is about. What were Muslims thinking about what the nature of the constitution should be in the early part of the 20th century? The theoretical approach that I have towards this draws from something known as the Cambridge School. The Cambridge School approach towards the history of thought has mainly been circulating around the idea of speech acts. Now, what are speech acts? Speech acts for the Cambridge School are essentially books. So when you look at other publications that have come out on the history of political thought, it is very easy to pin down a specific thinker with a specific book. So you have the great German idealist Hegel, and Hegel has written a book on the phenomenology of spirit. So that's the thinker and that's the book. You can do the same spiel with Machiavelli, with Locke, with any big thinker in the history of political thought. You have like a core book that you associate them with. And that's a little bit to do with the malaise that sort of enveloped European political thought. And that was that you have to produce a single monograph in which you sort of pen down every idea systematically. And Hegel would here really be kind of the pinnacle thinker who tries to systematically develop a theory of the world conclusively in a singular monograph. And because of this, a lot of people who were studying the history of legal and political thought thought and argued that there is no original legal or political thought in South Asia. And the reason they argued this was to say that, well, nobody really sat down and penned their ideas in a systematic manner as they were used to from somebody like Bentham or Locke or Hobbes or any of the other guys. They looked at India and they said, like, well, there's nothing really here. So we don't really have that. So if you open a good book on legal thought, you will see that mainly South Asia is present by absence. So there won't be any type of chapter that sort of engages or discusses South Asian legal thought, coming from the background that, well, there's no singular monograph through which we can capture this. So the first thing that I try to do with my book is a sort of methodological expansion. And the methodological expansion says that, well, if you can't figure out what people are thinking in terms of what their legal vision should be in a singular printed monograph, then maybe you have to look elsewhere. And that elsewhere for South Asian thinkers was mainly to do with politics. So in the European experience, what we have is a falling apart between theory and practice. You have people who are political practitioners who implement ideas, political and legal rules, and you have theoreticians. So everybody in the history of European legal thought would agree that somebody like Savigny is like a key and a great thinker. But then they start another discussion, which is to say that how were Savigny's idea relevant for the European political experience? In South Asia, you find something else where many of the thinkers are also practitioners. So you can go back to somebody like Ambedkar, the great Dalit sort of political activist. So he is a thinker at the same time, he's a practitioner. He's trying to transform politics while at the same time being detached from the political day-to-day affairs, thinking about politics. So his ideas would mainly be captured in speeches, in rallies, through political events that constitute transformative or that provide a specific transformative effect on the ground. And once you do that, suddenly a lot of thinkers from South Asia come into play as being constitutive thinkers about constitutionalism. For my book, because it's kind of like an opening into this debate, right? So I didn't go through systematically and now try to categorize 50 thinkers who have thought about Muslim constitutionalism. I mainly focus on two, the two prominent ones that are also transformative for South Asian politics, which are Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Muhammad Iqbal. So these are the two thinkers that I'm particularly interested in. And there's a bunch of ideas that I have about these thinkers, but I do believe that as a brief summary of where my project is coming from and what I intended to do with it, I think this brief introduction shall suffice. So I'll give it back to Aatir for any questions that he may have.
Thank you, Adeel. When I was going through your book yesterday night, so there are a few questions which erupted in my mind, so I want to discuss those questions with you, and I will be needing your take on those questions. My first question is, Muslims under colonial India were docile subjects. Is it a reality or a myth?
Well, that is a very good question, and I'm happy you read my book yesterday evening and not just before this session. So it's always good to have a little bit of buffer in between. Were they docile subjects? Let's go back to the 19th century. So there's a couple of big events that occur in India in the 19th century. The biggest one that I think possibly all of you are aware of are the watershed moments of 1857, 1858, which is known as the Savoy Rebellion, or the Great War of Independence, if you approach it from a sort of nationalistic perspective. Legally, these events are also really important, because this is the moment when the East India Company, the British East India Company, which had been operating as this kind of rogue entity that was initially started off as a trading outpost and then metastasized into the subcontinent, was transformed as crown rule. So now they were made subservient under a singular constitution. And generally people have said, or the arguments that people have sort of brought up as to why British India sought to bring everything under a singular legal umbrella had to do with the fact that they wanted to oppress and rule. And that's of course correct, right? So the British wanted to oppress and rule the entirety of the subcontinent and draw out as many resources as they possibly could in order to ram their economic expansion, which was off the charts in the 19th century. But another reason that they wanted to do this was much more homely, and it had to do with the legal architecture of colonial India. So up until 1857, the Mughal head, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was the Mughal king at the time, was still nominally the sovereign of the entirety of the Indian subcontinent, which means that when he started the uprising in 1857 and 1858, and the uprising was unsuccessful and the British captured him, they had a problem of putting him on trial. They still did, but it was a weird trial because they were making the argument that this man rebelled against himself because he was the sovereign, so he couldn't really start a rebellion against himself. So it led to a big problem for the British, a big legal problem for the British. And we had a lot of thinkers who were trying to make sense of the legal problem, and they said, you know, the Benthams of the world sitting in Whitehall in London, and they thought, well, the best way to solve this issue is to have a singular constitutional order with the crown on the top, because then we are much better able to police things such as sedition. Sedition was the key offense that the British sought to prosecute in the 19th century and in the 20th century, right? Any of the nationalist figures that you could think of, from Gandhi, Nehru, apart from Muhammad Ali Jinnah, but all the others spent quite substantive amounts of time in prison. And that had to do with the very strict laws around sedition that the British had implemented. So the British are thinking that, well, we need to have a singular constitutional order in order to prevent further uprisings from happening. And now the reaction to that legal order was twofold. On the one hand, the British allowed for religious accommodation. So they said that, well, this uprising that happened may have been primarily fueled by religion. And why did they think that it had been fueled by religion? Well, there were a bunch of imams who were sort of producing fatwas saying that it is legitimate to start a jihad against the British and sort of fight against the white men and driving out of the country because they're Kafirs. But the other reason that they thought it had to do with religion is that many of the colonial anthropological observers at the time took religion as the primary lens through which they viewed the subcontinent, right? From the census data that they were sort of collecting, they saw religion as the primary characteristics through which people made sense of themselves and of their politics. And they said that, well, if we don't want an uprising, what we need to do is accommodate their religious sentiments. And that happened in a wide number of ways. One of the most famous ones for Muslims was the so-called Anglo-Mohammedan law, where they tried to take Sharia law and couple it with a couple of interpretations that they had taken from white Orientalists, and they said that this is now this new order that we have produced, the new legal order that we're going to use, and we hope that this will appease the Muslims. And it worked better for Muslims than it did for Hindus by and large. The reason for which was to do with the fact that Muslims had a sustained tradition of thinking about legal orders well before the British came in. Before the British came in, I mentioned Bahadur Shah Zafar briefly, but the Mughal order was financing people and scholars, and they were giving them money and spaces and institutions in order to think about law, right? So therefore, the Muslims took to the new liberal legal order much more readily than did Hindus, who still had to come up with that tradition. So the reason why many people say that Hindu law of the 19th century is entirely invented and has nothing to do with traditional or orthodox Hindu law is the fact that there's no clear sort of building upon one layer of scholarship onto another layer of scholarship, as you find with Islamic and Muslim thought, especially Muslim legal thought. So Muslims were much more Sharia and legally minded than were the other groups. So therefore, what Muslims did and what they were able to do was to articulate their grievances through legal demands, something that in the early years of British colonialism, Hindus struggled a lot more with. Hindus were much better in asking for things such as representation, right? So they wanted representation, which was a kind of halfway political/legal demand. But Muslims were much better to couch their grievances and demands in a religious language. And that spins up all the way forward to, say, things such as the blasphemy legislation, right, which Muslims are sort of pushing for, and they see it then enshrined and embedded into the legal order. So coming back to the question whether Muslims are sort of more docile subjects, they're not docile in the sense that they were unable to engage with the colonial state politically. If 1857 is an indicator of anything, it's about the political nature that Muslims can sort of embrace and the sort of strength that they have when they come together as a unity. But then in the years that they were engaging with the colonial legal order, they had it much easier because they were able to articulate their grievances legally because there was a tradition for them of doing so.
Thank you. Thanks for your answer. My second question is, colonial regime started to introduce anti-blasphemy laws and other reforms into existing laws. Do you agree that it was beginning of religious sentimental politics when it comes to subcontinent?
Ooh, again, a very, very good question. I don't think it was the beginning of a religious politics. So let's wind back. So the colonial state introduces blasphemy legislation in the 1920s, and they introduce it because they say that the polemical debates between Hindus and Muslims, particularly in Lahore, because we are in Lahore, so particularly in Lahore, you had printing presses from both Hindu revivalist movements, the Arya Samaj in particular, and from Muslim revivalist movements who were battling each other every day in their newspapers, insulting each other and the religious founders of their particular religions. The British were initially very reluctant to move into this debate through legislation. The reason that they were very reluctant to move into this debate had to do with the general liberal ideas that were underpinning the colonial legal structures. So if you look at the colonial commentary by somebody like Bentham, then he would say that the one thing that we don't want to do in India is get involved in their religious debates, but we want to ensure that each side has complete freedom of speech as long as it doesn't contravene any of the other laws that we have, any of the other penal laws that we have in that country. So from that perspective, the British were very reluctant to intervene. So the Muslims, particularly Muslim groups here in Lahore, were pushing for the colonial state to introduce anti-blasphemy legislation. And they wanted anti-blasphemy legislation in particular, again, to protect the Muslim community against insults that the Arya Samaj were hurling against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, right? So that's essentially the setup. The British eventually sort of move in, start a 295A as a paragraph in penal law and say that you cannot insult the founder of any religious community. Now in academia, there's multiple positions on this issue. There's one position that says that, well, anything that the British do essentially produces a new essentialized identity. So for them, the colonial census produces a new form of Muslim identity that is then running through the 19th century. The protection of the Prophet Muhammad produces Muslims that are particularly sensitive when it comes to insults being hurled against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And I've never been convinced with that argument, right? So for me, yes, it's a nice argument in a seminar room when you're sitting somewhere in Oxford. It doesn't really work well on the ground because there has been a display of emotions whenever the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was involved in the 1900s. So it wasn't something that was just started by the British, and particularly by the British introducing colonial or anti-blasphemy legislation. So I see this as a much more long-running history, which is also to do with the fact that I don't think that everything that the British do essentially has this totalizing effect on the colonial population. In fact, I do believe that that argument, it was essentially formed, again, it's a little bit of trivia of the Cambridge School, because they were trying to make sense of the French Revolution and the events that led up to the French Revolution. And here a lot of academics said that absolutism was truly absolute, right? So you couldn't print anything, you couldn't say anything. So therefore, anything that was happening on this sort of higher levels of governance sort of trickled down in a much more stronger form than I believe it ever did on the Indian subcontinent. And this is not to underplay the violence that the colonial state sort of ushered into the Indian subcontinent. That is all there, and that is something that every scholar has to grapple with. But just to say that not everything is immediately we can't connect everything immediately back to the British in a direct manner.
I ask, open the house for questioning and question, or you want to ask something? He has given a couple of chapters on Iqbal and Qaeda. So my next questions after this one, my next question will be regarding what was Qaeda when it comes to Muslim politics.
को कॉपी किया है अपने आइन में, तो क्या उनके जो आइन के जो जो उनके प्रिंसिपल्स हैं लीगल एंड कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल, उनको क्या हमने अडॉप्ट किया है अपने कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन, क्योंकि वो तो अगेंस्ट थे वेस्टर्न पार्लियामेंट।
Okay, so I think there's a lot in this question, so let's unpack it a little. The first move that I would probably make is to think about Muhammad Iqbal, right? Muhammad Iqbal is possibly one of the thinkers whose legal thought has been mostly stretched in all types of ideological spheres that you can find. So if anybody, it really depends on what kind of book you open. If it discusses Muhammad Iqbal's like political thought at all, and I'm using political and legal thought here interchangeably simply because there hasn't been anything really written on Iqbal's legal thought yet. So I hope that this is the contribution that I'm doing with my book. So if we think about Iqbal's political thought, then it's mainly been stretched in multiple directions. If we were to apply those directions into a legal framework, then we would find him as either a supporter of liberal democracy in a democratic fashion, where we would have a specific unity between Hindus and Muslims, so somebody who's against partition. Right? Iqbal passed away before partition was finalized, so before the state of Pakistan came into being. So he dies in the late 1930s. Pakistan doesn't happen until 1947. So it's always a big mystery of where he stood on the Pakistan question. Not really a mystery, but it's debated in academia. So one way would be to say that, well, Iqbal wanted a liberal constitutional order in which Hindus and Muslims live peacefully together in a democratic state. And the arguments that scholars could give for this would be his praise for this sort of syncretic culture that we find in India in the 19th century. And there's a number of Iqbal's poems where he's sort of celebrating that. And he's celebrating that almost all the way up until his death. So we could say that maybe that's what he wanted. Another one would be that we could say that, well, he wanted a liberal order, a liberal constitutional order that was non-democratic. Something that we saw in the colonial regime itself, where you have not a universal franchise where everybody is allowed to vote, like in a democracy, but where you have limited franchise, where only certain people are allowed to appear in the polls and participate in the political project. And the argument as to why Iqbal would be a supporter of that is that he never came out strongly against the British colonial state like other people of his time did. For instance, he never returned his knighthood. He's still Sir Muhammad Iqbal. And he has written multiple pieces where he's praising the British constitutional order as it stood with, for instance, the India Act of 1935. We could also say, and that's a third pathway into Iqbal's thoughts, say that he was more of a socialist. And that's a very strong tradition, particularly in academia. You would not be surprised. It's a very strong tradition where lots of people are arguing that, well, Iqbal was essentially a socialist. And there's a lot of his verses and couplets that we can use in order to support that claim too. And then there's a last one, which is less popular, but which says that Iqbal was a supporter of Sharia-based constitutional order, something very akin to what we find in Pakistan after 1971. So now again, coming back to the Speech Act theory that I mentioned at the beginning, if we were to apply that, so the standard methodological toolkit that we have in order to make sense as to what historical figures wrote and what they meant when they were writing it, right? What's the bigger sort of discursive web of meaning that they're sort of engaging with? Then we would say that all of these things are true at once because we have speech acts sort of pushing for each one of these opinions. And a chronological approach doesn't really solve this dilemma. So if we say that, well, maybe Iqbal was like really for the syncretic Hindustan when he was younger, but then as he matured, he turned into a conservative thinker who was really pushing for Sharia law. But that doesn't work because all the way up until the end, Iqbal is sort of active in his writings to celebrate all of these different constitutional visions. So the way in which I try to resolve it, and that's what you will find in the chapter that Aatir briefly mentioned, is to not look at Iqbal's writing so much, but to look at the concrete political interventions that he did in the last decade of his life. And there's two big political interventions that Iqbal is doing here that I think are really pushing the needle into one side, and that's really the conservative, sort of Sharia-minded side of Iqbal's thoughts. The first one has to do with the issue of divorce. So in the 1930s, there was a big issue whether, if and how divorces, especially when women were asking for a gula, should be formalized in the Anglo-Mohammedan legal order. Women always had the right under Sharia law in order to ask for divorces, but it was particularly difficult for them to do so, borderline impossible. So Iqbal is weighing in on that issue and arguing from a very Sharia-minded perspective. The second issue is the Kashmir issue, where Iqbal is sort of rallying for support and trying to find people to support or to get rid of the Hindu Raja who's ruling over mostly Muslim-majority province. And the Kashmir committee that Iqbal has, he begins with expressing ideas that are very akin to a sort of Muslim constitution. And a Muslim constitution that takes some inspiration from Sharia law. Iqbal's Sharia law is an entire topic in itself, and there's multiple books that should be written, could and should be written on it. The way in which I understand Iqbal is that he's a conservative thinker, but within his conservatism, he's leaving multiple leeway for change in the present. So he's not one of these conservative thinkers who's trying to revive the constitution of Medina. That's not Iqbal. So he's basing a lot on consensus, ijma, etc. But he is, in essence, still, for me, a conservative thinker.
I have one comment to make when it comes to the personality of Iqbal. If we go through the book, Reconstruction of Legal Thought in Islam, Dr. Iqbal, he has discussed a lot when it comes to institutionalization and reformation of ijtihad, ijma, and other sources and system of Muslim political thought. So sometimes when it comes to running the state and the institutions, Iqbal is a reformist in my secondly, I have one question because we discussed Iqbal and his role. So, sir, I was reading your chapter on Iqbal. So, a question erupted in my mind, and that was, how do you see Iqbal in communal politics of communal Punjab? So, how was his role in that particular area?
Okay. So Iqbal's. Okay. So I would say that the Muhammad Iqbal that somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, is celebrating in his book, where he says that Iqbal was this great syncretic thinker who tried to think Hinduism and Islam at the same time, is not true. And the main reason I believe it's not true has to do with the engagement that Iqbal had with communalism as it erupted in the 1930s in Lahore. So what we tend to forget is that the Khatmi-Nabuwwat debate as it's sort of unfurling in Pakistan today really is based on much of Iqbal. So he was pushing for it in the 1930s, he's pushing for anti-blasphemy legislation, and he's coming out against the Arya Samaj influence in colleges and institutions across Lahore. So whereas Iqbal really started out as somebody who saw everything maybe more in a syncretic manner, it is not something that he's actively doing as a politician in the 1930s. So where does Iqbal sort of put in the weight? And it's not on the side of the liberal sort of, it's not on the side of the liberal landed elite, right, as people like to accuse him. We're sort of saying that, well, let's just tame these communal tensions and let's just focus on agricultural output, etc. Iqbal is very much on the side of the people who are asking for transformations and change. And just briefly, because you brought it up, initially my entire spiel was about how there's not a single systematic book that people from the subcontinent in the 20th and 19th and 20th century have written regarding their legal and political vision. You mentioned the reconstruction of legal thought by Allama Iqbal. So that is a book, but it's not written in the same with the same kind of depth. It's a series of lectures that Iqbal gives, 6 lectures. He's in Hyderabad, he's in other provinces where he's sort of speaking more or less off the cuff in order to make sense of the Muslim condition and what he would want to see. But it's kind of more of a sketch. So think of the reconstruction as more of a sketch rather than of a deep sort of intellectual engagement. So if you look at old 18th century Islamic treatises, then you will see that they go much deeper, whereas Iqbal's engagement, it's written in English, which is a big difference from all of the others that are written in Persian and Urdu and Arabic. So it's written in English, and here Iqbal really tries to communicate to an English audience, right? So he's producing this book in order to tell the Orientalists who are sitting in Leiden, Cambridge, and Oxford that Muslims do think, and this is a sketch of how they think. And another takeaway for that is that the book is published with Oxford University Press, right? In the 1920s, if you want to communicate to the Lahori public at large, you don't publish your book with Oxford University Press. It's a mistake that even I did 100 years later, right? If you want to communicate with the public at large, do not publish with the OUP.
So, discussed at length regarding role of Jinnah, and you have described him as a thinker of existential survival. So what is your take on that, and how you can explain that particular terminology which you have discussed regarding Jinnah?
Jinnah is a very, very interesting constitutional thinker. And the main way in which people have tried to make sense of Jinnah is as a committed constitutionalist, right? You can pick up any book, Aisha Jalal, even like the Counter View by Ishtiaq Ahmed. I mean, essentially it's a celebration of Jinnah as a lawyer. You know, look at this man. He was a very cold-blooded, rational man who was sort of looking at the best possible legal position to argue for the Muslim minority, to get the most concession out of the British state and carve out a space where Muslims could operate politically. Like the Jinnah that I've found is a lot more Schmittian. With Schmittian, I mean he's a lot more into real politics. So essentially the politics of somebody like Carl Schmitt, the German legal thinker. And I think Jinnah is a lot more Schmittian because he understood politics. And a lot of the debates that are happening in the 1940s that Jinnah, as the president of the Muslim League, is having with his counterpart, and his counterpart changes, but for the longest time, it's a guy called Jawaharlal Nehru, who later becomes the Prime Minister of India and runs India for 16 years. A lot of these debates, to me, look like Jinnah is constantly willing to depart from the conventional politics of the Government of India Act of 1935, where it is Nehru who's always seen as this great charismatic sort of politician who has huge popular support. He's struggling in order to connect with the public, and he's constantly going back as a sort of legal stiffler to the rules and trying to frame his arguments in a legal form. Even though my book ends in the 1940s, one of the takeaway arguments, which I don't think, which I've never understood why nobody who looks at partition has ever considered, is that the very reason Pakistan comes into being is because the Muslim League boycotts the Constituent Assembly of 1947. So they boycott the Constituent Assembly, which was a united Constituent Assembly that came into being because of the India Independence Act, and the Muslims do not participate in it, whereas it is the Congress who are saying that no, you have to participate. Not only do you have to participate, but the outcome of the Constituent Assembly is going to be sovereign law. Law is framed legally through the Constituent Assembly. So for some reason, the great constitutional thinker Muhammad Ali Jinnah didn't think it was a good idea to enter this, but still everybody thinks that he is the one who's the committed constitutionalist and Nehru is not. So all I'm saying is that I do believe that Jinnah was much, I think people have established a very narrow-minded Jinnah so far, and Jinnah was much more sensitive to what was happening in South Asia, and to me had a much better grasp on politics than his counterparts who were generally celebrated for understanding politics so well, like Nehru.
You started your book in your first page, you have discussed at length about Sir Syed, the role of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan. So, my question is Sir Syed really a political prophet of Muslims when it comes to Indian subcontinent?
In hindsight, he is. That's a very short answer. In hindsight, he is. At the time, he wasn't. So at the time, Sir Syed was writing, this is the 19th century, right? So the British, 1857 has just happened, the British are trying to make sense. How could this happen? And they're writing their own books through their Orientalist scholars who are sort of purveying and surveying the grounds and trying to make sense how this could happen. And on the other side, you have Indian Muslims who are also trying to make sense how this could happen. So Syed, who's administrator of the British East India Company of the time, writes a book. And this book is him trying to make sense how the Baghavat could have happened, how the rebellion sort of took place. And he, from this book onwards, he essentially conceives of politics alongside the big moniker of religion, right? So he sees a Muslim politics and he sees a Hindu politics. And in hindsight, of course, that's how it turned out, right? Because the 20th century was just the politics of communalism. In the 19th century, there was a brief period where people like Ram Mohan Roy were moving and reinventing Hinduism to such an extent that they felt that, well, the Muslims could also be included. Since we're making up this entire enterprise from scratch in the 1900s, then why not say that Muslims can also be a part of this order? So Syed Ahmad didn't believe it, and the reason he didn't believe it from today's standard was, of course, because of the different religious affiliation, but it also had to do with racism. So the Indian National Congress was something that was born in Bengal. And we tend to forget that North Indians had a very strong opinions about Bengal. They saw them as inferior beings. And that's what Sir Syed Ahmad would also write. So he would say that how can Bengalis ever rule over Rajputs and Jats? It's impossible. So apart from the religious logic that he was applying, that the Indian National Congress was a party of Hindus and for Hindus, and was mainly staffed with people from Bengal, he would also write that, well, these Bengalis can never rule over the people of North India. So yes, Sir Syed turned out to be very prescient and true, because the same kind of racial logic also led to the breakup of Pakistan, with the two wings splitting, where you had a very strong argument that was present in the Punjab, that the only ruling elite could come from the north, and it could never come from a place such as Bengal. So if we go back to Sir Syed, like his two big prophecies, that the Bengal can never rule over the north, and that Hindus and Muslims cannot live together, turned out to be correct.
Thank you. Now we will take a few questions from the audience. If you have any question, you can ask. Sir, just one question from him, and then I will come to you. Ji.
So I'm curious, was the legal thought that was developing when you talk about Sharia law, was it very anti-colonial, or was there a hope to make a hybrid or a mix between Sharia law and colonial law and points of reconciliation?
It's very much the latter. So if you, there's a couple of books that have come out that make the argument that no, it's revolutionary. So the turn towards religion was always a revolutionary move, right? So you move towards religion in order to get rid of colonialism. But the colonial legal structure was very well adapted in order to accommodate religious laws and religious sentiments. So whenever you're pushing in that direction, I don't really see how that is immediately how you're able to interpret that immediately as anti-colonial. So from that perspective, I see somebody like Syed Ahmad Khan, I mean, there's never really a discussion. He was pro-colonialism. Like his big institutions were all established hand in hand with colonialism, the Anglo-Mohammedan College over in Agra. So all of these places are established hand in hand with, not Agra, Aligarh, of course, are established hand in hand with British colonialism. For Iqbal, it's a little bit more complicated, because Iqbal is writing at a time where it was already clear that British colonialism is not going to last, right? So in the 1930s, essentially after the First World War, it is clear that the British are going to leave. The question is only when are they going to leave and what country are they going to leave behind. So in the 1930s, when Iqbal is sort of pushing for a specific Sharia vision that he has for the constitution of a future political entity. It's not anti-colonial because it is clear that you don't have to be anti-colonial anymore because it's clear that colonialism is going to withdraw. And then with the outbreak of the Second World War, it becomes clear that it is no longer able for the British to hold on towards their global empire. The other problem is that there's so many people from India who are fighting in both the First and the Second World War, and you have people fighting for European freedoms in Europe and then returning to colonialism in their own country. So the very argument of colonialism doesn't work anymore in the middle of the 20th century. So I would say that when Iqbal is writing, it's also not super anti-colonial because it's already clear that the British are going to depart. It's certainly not anti-British.
और पर्सनल लॉ अंग्रेजों ने हमें ज्यादा अच्छा दिया हुआ था. ये तो you are talking about nitty-gritty. I'm asking you the bigger picture. Bigger picture is what is constitutional concept. You know the Gymkhana Club, where it was written before, Indians and dogs are not allowed to enter in the Gymkhana Club. Now this rules of the governance, this constitution, it is similar Gymkhana Club. It is very difficult to become the member of Gymkhana, but I did 10 years. For the member of this Gymkhana Parliament Club, you can enter any time. Certain privileged elite class people, they are entering in the parliament. What were the bigger constitutional thoughts of Iqbal and Allama Iqbal? The allowance, how we can make it a Gymkhana Club or the real parliament of the common people.
When it comes to Gymkhana and clubs like that. Actually, when it comes to
yeah, I mean, just as a very brief answer to this question. So Iqbal was non-elite. So Iqbal doesn't come like all the other people from elite background. So he's not like Nehru. He doesn't go to, I think Nehru went to Harrow. He doesn't go to the big boarding schools. He enters the colonial education system very late. And he goes to Cambridge, but when he's in his 30s, right? So he doesn't go in his younger days, and he's essentially always connected to a non-elite subjectivity. So he enters parliament, so he would probably support certain examples, and I'm sure that Iqbal would have wanted a more inclusive democracy. So if he was here today, he would have argued against these, the Gymkhanization of parliament, if that's something I can call it. Thanks.
Any other question from the audience? Yep.
He seems to be pleading for a secular Pakistan. But in many other pronouncements, he seems to be really going for a real Islamic state. How do you make sense of his various pronouncements? What was real Jinnah pleading for?
That's great. It goes back to the point that I was trying to make earlier, because I see Jinnah as being very much in touch with the politics of the ground, which was politics revolving around Muslim symbolisms. I would think that Jinnah was more on the side, wasn't like entirely on the side of a liberal constitutionalism as people would have wanted him to be. Because then, if he really wanted that, why didn't he join the Constituent Assembly of India? Like, it was all set. Like, they were waiting for him. There were empty seats. People were waiting for Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the Muslim League to participate. That would have been the secular politics if he had wanted that type of secular politics. Now, of course, we could say that, well, he wanted that secular politics, but he wanted to have reservations. He wanted a better deal. And then it just went bad, right? Because the Congress didn't give in, he couldn't get like the deal that he wanted, and then he had to run with his bluff and create Pakistan. I don't believe that. I don't think Pakistan was created merely because Jinnah wanted more concessions from the other side. I think Jinnah wanted a Pakistan. He wanted a place where Muslims could live according to their cultures and their traditions, and he wanted them to produce and engage with both the constitution, with the legal order, and with the future polity. And because he was fundamentally a future-oriented project, right? Because there wasn't a Muslim democratic state on Indian soil ever before. Because it was a future-oriented project, he didn't define everything, but he left it to the coming generations to figure out of what the concrete nature should be. So if people in Pakistan now overwhelmingly would want a secular Pakistan, then that would be Pakistan, right? So that would be the new vision of Pakistan. If they would want a sort of more religiously minded Pakistan, then that would be the nature of Pakistan. And both of these perspectives are within the legal thought of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. What he didn't want was Hindu majoritarianism. What he didn't want was that the overwhelming majority in a democracy would be, or the determining factor of a democracy would be the Hindu vote. That's what Jinnah was afraid of. He was afraid of the consolidated Hindu vote, where all Hindus would vote in one direction, and even if all Muslims would come together in a united India, they would vote in another direction. They would never be able to set policies. That was his big fear. The moment he said that, well, now Muslims can decide their own faith, there can be factionalism, they can have different opinions, and they can stretch all the way from a secular vision of Pakistan to a sort of more Sharia-minded vision of Pakistan, and they're all accommodated within Jinnah's thought. So I feel that we shouldn't look back too much on Muhammad Ali Jinnah in order to figure out where we want to go with Pakistan, but that's something for all of us to decide of what we want Pakistan to be.
Out of time, so my last question, and that will be concluding everything. You have told us that this book is the result of your research, which you did at Cambridge. So what were your conclusions, and how did you see way forward when it comes to the Muslim political thought?
Okay, I keep that one very short because I think I've talked a lot, and people want to be released into the break. I do feel that one of the outcomes of the book was that it opened up new scholarship that can emerge regarding Muslim constitutional thought in the 19th and 20th century. So rather than saying that, well, we want to understand the constitutional order of India in the 19th century, and we conventionally turn to people like Mill and Bentham, we can now turn to people who have non-British names and who are from the Indian subcontinent. So that's hopefully the outcome of this book.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. And thank you all.